I'd like to share with you the story of how I first encountered the name Charles POLIQUIN. Now, the strength coach Charles POLIQUIN has a huge impact on my life, even through to this day, because his principles affect how I train in the weight room, how I approach nutrition and diet and sleep. Now, many fitness influencers and um, health industry professionals are now advocating that we all improve our sleep. But it was Charles POLIQUIN from whose mouth I first heard about the importance of sleep. And this was on, I think it was a Facebook Q&A that Charles posted on YouTube. So of course you're going to get hit with random questions. And somebody asked him, what's a way I can increase my anabolic aspect, right, naturally? And so I'm thinking, as Charles is reading the question, I'm thinking he's going to come up with a supplement, or he's going to come up with a workout routine to say how you can make yourself more anabolic naturally. But to my shock, what Charles said is, right away he goes, sleep. You have to improve your sleep. That's the number one factor if you want to increase your anabolic factor, right? So that was really eye-opening for me. That was probably at least 5 years ago that I caught that video. But from that point forward, I've made an effort to work or be at least mindful about how I prepare myself to sleep and how I wake up and how I just set up conditions to try to have as much restful sleep as possible. And interestingly enough, that was one thing that Charles pointed out to, that he felt that maybe he had made in error earlier on in his career. He said he figured the attitude back then was, we can all just sleep when we're dead, so he would just limit himself to 4-hour sleep. He'd work very long hours. But he says he realized later that that was not the most optimal choice. But let's jump back in time and location to how I first encountered Charles POLIQUIN's name. And that would have been back in the early 80s in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So Charles was born and was still living and working in Ottawa. That's the nation's capital of Canada. I believe he was mostly working out of the University of Ottawa, Université d'Ottawa, because that was the bilingual university in Ottawa. There's also Carleton University, which was more geared towards engineering and whatnot. But the University of Ottawa did have a phys ed program. Now, at that time, I was training at Takahashi Dojo on Melrose Avenue, and I was a member of the Ontario provincial judo team and trying to sort of work my way into Canadian national team. But because we were a pretty strong dojo, every now and again there would be either a provincial training camp held at our club. These training camps would rotate location. Quite often we'd head off to Montreal, Quebec for training camps, or over towards the Toronto area for training camps. But as such, I got to be on the mat with very elite judoka at that time, members of the Canadian national team. And one post-workout session, I remember we're all just kind of hanging out, shooting the breeze, which never happens, right? And somehow the topic of strength training, weight training came up. Now you have to remember, this is back in the 80s, where the cutting edge were those steel chrome universal stations. We thought, bench pressing was lying down on that bench that was fixed to one of those 4-station universal machines and using that sort of U-shaped bar, sticking the pin in the plates and then pressing up, and that was our bench press. We didn't bench press with a barbell because we didn't have a proper power rack or anything like that. The other sort of popular machine at that time was, of course, the Nautilus machines. And I had never seen like a full rack of dumbbells all matching, you know, nicely lined up with 2 rows. I mean, everyone just had a bunch of ragtag dumbbells lying around against the wall or something. So it was a completely different era still back in the 80s. Really, I mean, it wasn't normal for your average person to go to a gym and lift weights. It was kind of like something that weird people did, or only people who were interested in Olympic weightlifting or bodybuilding fanatics who were considered weirdos at that time. It certainly weren't influencers way back in the 80s. They were just sort of fringe and out there. But anyway, so we were just kind of all lounging around on the mat post-practice, and somehow Charles' name came up. And I can remember clearly one of the heavyweight guys was just shaking his head and going, "Oh my God, that guy's workouts are just so brutal, man." And everyone was just, the other guys were kind of in agreement with him and just shaking their head. And me being this like young newbie 98-pound aspiring judoka, you know, I chime in and go, "Well, you know, what makes them so hard? How come they're so hard?" And the guys just shot me this like kind of dirty look, and they just said, "You know, trust me, they're brutal." Now again, fast forward to present moment, now I know why they're brutal, and now I know why nobody back in the 80s could articulate why Charles Poliquin's routines were so brutal, because we did not have the language back then. Remember, you have to put yourself back into an era when this just wasn't, weightlifting was not common knowledge. We knew what sets and reps were, but there was no notion of, number one, certain exercises. We didn't know what these were called. We didn't know what a step up was. Probably most people knew what a bench press, a squat, and a deadlift were, but they probably didn't know what the proper form was. And what really makes Charles Poliquin's workouts, as we say, brutal, are not just the exercise choice, not just the number of sets and reps, but it's the timed rest period between sets, and it's his tempo recipe, meaning you must control the eccentric for a certain count. You either pause or you don't pause at the bottom. Concentric is typically 1 count, or it's explosive, and then maybe there's a pause or no pause at the top of the motion. But this is one of the key aspects of all of Charles' workouts, is he's incredibly specific to what we call the tempo. And again, for those of you guys who lift, you know that if you have to control the eccentric, that can be just as tough as exploding for the concentric aspect of the motion. The other aspect that makes, another aspect that makes Charles Poliquin's workouts so brutal from 80s to present moment, because they're still structured the same way, is that he breaks down a workout for a primary exercise, or sort of the A exercises, which are typically full body, multi-joint, as we say, exercises. So the big exercises, such as a squat, a deadlift, a bench, a press. Then there are B sets of exercises, which are more remedial. And then finally C sets of exercises, a third set of exercises, which are more for the smaller single joint movements, like a bicep curl, tricep extension, or abdominal work. But another part of the weightlifting language that we did not have back at that time was the fact that these exercises were going to be performed as either supersets, meaning 2 exercises alternating, or giant sets, sometimes 3 sets, 3 exercises in a row, and then back to the first exercise, repeat. But that's another sort of aspect of a workout that makes it more brutal, because there's a shorter rest interval from one exercise to the next, because the theory is, because you're working different muscle groups, you don't need to take as long of a break between sets. This allows you to complete more overall volume within a given workout, like a single workout of, say, 1 hour, which, by the way, was the amount of time that Charles prescribed. Typically said if you're spending more than 60 minutes in the gym, you're socializing, you're not working out. Yet another aspect of Charles' workouts that made them brutal was if you successfully complete the specified number of repetitions within the set at a specified weight, well, guess what? You don't get to repeat at the same weight. You have to add more weight for the next set. And you will do that until maybe the third set. Maybe now you've added weight twice. Maybe that's a little bit too much and you don't quite complete that set. Okay, but now you know that's the point of failure. So now you know that's the point that you want to break through. But the nature of that law of progressive overload, as we call it, is that you're always working yourself towards a point of failure. And if you never get it, then that means you're way underloading your barbell. The whole point of progressive overload is to approach a point of failure, find it, and then the next workout you're going to try to work through that. But that in and of itself can be kind of mentally draining or mentally taxing depending on how you approach it. So I'm saying all this just to reassure those of you who worked with Charles POLIQUIN or knew him, say in the more recent years, fear not, because Charles' name struck dread and yet respect in the hearts of some of Canada's toughest male athletes way back when in the 1980s.